Hello,
Adam.
hello, Amity. First, and hello to everyone who's watching. I want to welcome you all, and this is a. It's. I'm sorry we're not doing it in person. The Center for Fiction, if you don't know it, is a beautiful space. We have been imagining ourselves up there doing this. And one of the reasons that I'm excited to be here and be able to do it with Amity is because we're very old friends. And this is really, to me, just a conversation with a friend that about a book that I admire hugely and that while I will be asking questions about it, I actually know a great deal about it already because I've seen and heard and read through this book and really for all the years since we were in graduate school many years ago, Amity and I are each other's first readers, and she's certainly my closest reader. And There's just a friendship that is independent of fiction but lives inside of literature that I value enormously. And so I come not as a interviewer, sort of with an external critic or interviewer, but a friend with a heavy bias in favor of.
May, may I second that too?
Sure.
I'm so
Yeah.
grateful for your role in this book. We were reminiscing right before the reading started about a time when I was really stuck with Sea Wife and in fact was reduced to tears in Pan Quotidian on 53rd.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
In 2017 or 17 when I lost 100 years there. But Adam, you helped talk me through that. And I know you and I both teach, and I think there are even some students here. And I think we're often saying, telling them how valuable it is to have somebody like that in your writing mind, and someone you trust enough to open yourself up and accept help from. And you were that for me. And I just needed to cry a bit and have that conversation with you and rededicate myself to work, and you really helped me with that. It was a hard process, a tough book to write, so thank you.
Well, no, and it's you never like to see your friends cry into their salad, but you got through that, and it's so there are other we were the other thing that's happening now with it that you just told me about that I just found out about a minute ago is the New York Times is gonna have the book as the monthly pick for May as a discussion book. New York NYT Books Instagram, I think, is going to feature that. So check that out.
On Monday night, it'll be Instagram Live. Yeah.
Well, congrats. I mean, it's
Thank
great.
you. Thank you.
And you can click on that button any old time throughout the whole entirety of this. And that actually, I mean, we laugh about it, but like the Center for Fiction is a great place, and this is a way for bookstores. You're not clicking through to Amazon when you do that. So anyway, welcome. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have a reading from the book, and then we're going to talk, and I'm going to ask Amity some questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience as well. But obviously the book's just come out, so we're not imagining everybody's read it. So I just thought, Amity, maybe we could start. You could just, beyond the jacket copy or, the summary of the plot, how would you describe your novel, this novel, Sea Wife?
I would describe it as a dialogue between two characters, a man and a woman, about many things, but about namely their decision to sort of throw off their conventional life and buy a boat sight unseen in Panama, and go sailing. The plan is for a year with their 2 young children. One is only 2.5 and one is 7. And part of the idea of them doing this is to reconnect with one another, and as a couple, and also to help Juliet, the woman in the relationship, recover from her depression.
Right. Well, with that in mind, you could maybe tell us what reading are we going to be doing, and what is the audience about to hear?
We are going to read from the very beginning of the book, so it's no sweat. You don't have to know anything more than what I just said, but if I may, I'd like to just show also what it looks like on the page, which is that there are these 2 voices and they rotate quite frequently. You see that a lot here. So one reason why I'm reading it with Adam, other than it's just cool and I don't have to do it all by myself, is that the voices really do interject and echo and contradict. And that was something I was really interested in as a writer. So I'll be reading Juliet and Adam will be my husband, Michael. I can't see you, Adam, but I think that's just me, but it doesn't matter. We can still hear each other.
Yes.
Where does a mistake begin? Lately, I've found the simple question difficult, impossible, actually. A mistake has roots in both time and space, a person's reasoning and her whereabouts. Somewhere in the intersection of those 2 dimensions is the precisely bounded mistake, in nautical terms, its coordinates. Did my mistake begin with the boat or my marriage itself? I don't think so. I now suspect that my mistake took root in an innocent experience I forgot to decipher, the mystery of which has quietly ruled me. For example, I remember standing beside a blindingly blue Howard Johnson's motel pool at 12 years old, watching a couple undress one another through a half-drawn curtain, while my estranged father disputed the bill in the lobby. Should I have looked away? Did the miscalculation occur even earlier? As I sat on a rope rug in clean kindergarten sunlight, and I leaned toward the boy beside me and accepted his insistent whisper, I still feel his dew in my ear. And now I am sitting in a closet, Michael's closet. I should explain. Several days ago, I came in here looking for something of his and discovered that the carpet is very plush. The slatted bifold doors filter the sunlight beautifully. I feel calm in here. Hiding in closets is the habit of children, I know. I used to hide in my mother's closet when I was a kid. Her closet contained some dressy silks and wools she never wore. I loved holding these fabrics against my body or stepping into her high heels as if onto a dais, rehearsing my future. I never felt ashamed. Surely there's some connection between seeking refuge in my mother's closet long ago and hiding in Michael's now, but that insight does not help me. Sometimes life just writes you tiny, awful poems. To be honest, I'm uncertain whether or not I can survive this day. I mean, if I want to. To go outside requires preparation and composure. If I were to go out to start walking around and seeing people again and going to the grocery store and getting on with it, invariably what someone would ask me is, do you wish you'd never gone? They will expect me to say, yes, our journey was a mistake. But I do not regret saying yes to the boat. Saying yes to the boat was my clearest act of loyalty toward my husband. I can't afford to regret it. If I did, I would only be left with my many disloyalties.
January 17th, 10:15 a.m. Log of Yacht Juliet. From Porvenir, towards Cayos Limones, 9 degrees, 33.5 minutes north, 78 degrees, 56.98 minutes west, northwest wind 10 knots, seas 2 to 4 feet. Notes and remarks. We are 102 nautical miles east-northeast of Panama City, catching prevailing winds into the sovereign territory of San Blas. The shape of the coast is still visible behind us, but ahead is just water, nothing but water. That's when I realize there's only one ocean, one big mother ocean. Yes, there are bays and seas and straits, but those are just words. artificial divisions. Once you're out here, you see there's just one unbroken country of water. You'd never feel this way on land, not in our country. What a feeling. Generations of sailors have failed to describe it. So what are my chances? Me, Michael Partlow. Michael Partlow, who can't tell you the title of a single poem. Just ask my wife. Her head is full of them.
When I first met him, I thought I'd never marry a guy like that. Too persnickety, too conventional, no sense of humor. But I was wrong. Marriage and kids and the grind made Michael morbidly funny. He got funnier and funnier while I, who had been funny, got less funny. There was this ratty muscle shirt to which he was superstitiously attached when we were living aboard the boat. The memory of this shirt makes me laugh out loud. While sailing in hot climates, you start wearing as little as possible. And cruising kids, they dress like lunatics, wearing grass skirts under flamenco dresses with muck boots and shell necklaces, mementos of places they've been. I have no idea where Michael got the muscle shirt. Panama City? Standing ashore, beaming with his boyish face and unwashed hair, he looked like a prep school kid who'd gotten lost on a hike 20 years ago.
The crew of our vessel is fit and in good spirits. Bosun Sybil Partlow, age 7, is sitting in First Mate Juliet Partlow's lap in the cockpit. Deckhand George Doodle Partlow, age 2.5, is doing his best to stand upright in the small swell. He's pantless, waiting for First Mate to let him whiz off the side of the boat. His growing vocabulary is strictly maritime. Fish go, boat go. A very large sea turtle just surfaced portside, head like a periscope. Sybil says it's a spy. Whenever Sybil says anything cute, she tells me to write it down. That turtle's a spy. Write that down in your book, Daddy. Pardon me, I say? Are you speaking to me? What do you call me underway, bosun? She laughs. Okay, write that down in your book, Captain.
The muscle shirt was so funny because he's normally such a neatnik, a dandy, and a rearranger. He needs almost no sleep. His mother said he'd always been that way. Here at the house, he used to work late into the night, sending emails and finishing reports, but mostly man tinkering, learning about electrical wiring by gutting another appliance or making little toys for the kids. In the morning, he'd leave for work as shiny as an apple. He wouldn't let the children eat in his commuting car. Goldfish, Triscuits, verboten. But the family car, my car, lawless. An layer of organic material composted under the seats. I understand it now, sitting here. I understand how nice it must have been for him to have a little fiefdom, a closet where shoes are paired and the world is shut out and you get to make all your own choices. My closet just there on the other side of our bedroom is haphazard. I gave up trying to neaten it when Sybil was a toddler. After months of hanging them up, I just left all the blouses on the floor where she'd pulled them off the hangers. She'd shuffle out of the closet in my shoes, unsteady as a drunk, and leave them under tables and sofas. But I'm a mother. Gradually, I just gave them all away, all my spaces, one by one, down to the very last closet.
I know it appears that what we are doing is radical, but the truth is there are so many people out here, sprinkled all around the hydrosphere, sailboats, sloops, catamarans, replicas of famous schooners, wealthy paranoids, retirees, people traveling with cats, people traveling with lizards, people sick of giving 1/4 of their income to the government, free spirits, charlatans, and yes, children. There are thousands of children sailing this world as we speak.
Let me begin by saying that buying a boat was the most absurd idea I'd ever heard. I'd never boarded anything but a ferry in my life, and Michael hadn't sailed since he was in college. You've got to be kidding me, I said to him. You want me and our 2 little kids to live on a boat with you in the middle of the sea? Just for a year, he said. I don't even know how to sail, Michael. You don't need to know how to sail, he said. All you need to know is which way to point the boat. I can teach you the rest as we go. You're insane, I said.
Naturally, it took a long time for Juliet to come around to the idea. More than once, she pointed out that my father died when he was just a little older than I am now. So maybe I was feeling something breathing down my neck, i.e. eternal quietus. And she could understand how spooky that might feel, but maybe could this particular psychodrama be solved with something less extreme, like a triathlon? I don't disagree. She was right. Every marriage needs one skeptic to keep it safe, but a marriage of two skeptics will fail to thrive.
I do know a lot of poems from those hours in my carrel at Boston College trying to write my dissertation before we moved out to the land of steady habits. Ironically, one reason I gave up on studying poetry is because it seemed brutally impractical compared to the urgencies of raising two children. But these days, inside my closet, poetry is as real to me as an axe. I need it more than food. Lines come and go in my mind. I don't even remember who wrote them. I eat very little, mostly just dinner with the kids, and I lap from the bathroom tap when I'm thirsty. During the day, when I have to leave the closet, I push open the doors and cross our carpeted bedroom in my socks. When I return to our bedroom, sometimes I linger by the front windows where birds mob our blighted apple tree, not realizing they can be nakedly seen through the leafless branches. I spy on them as the occasional curious neighbor spies on me. Our plain white house is now a point of interest. It's been on the news. I see the way people walking past our house slow down and how, if in pairs in the evening, they exchange a somber look. Vivas to those who have failed, and to those whose war vessels sank in the sea, and to those themselves who sank in the sea. It's true, history is written by the victors. That's why we need poets to sing of the defeats.
Well,
Thank you for reading.
of course. So, you hopefully people get a little bit of a sense there that the dialogue that you talked about, that it's this back and forth, and of the setting of the situation that will unfold of them being on this family of four, being on this boat. And obviously, needless to say, all of this was dreamt up and published, dreamt up and written well before the pandemic arrived. And yet, as it turns out, you have written a book about a family trying to survive in a very confined space, suddenly living together 24/7, wondering, are they going to make it? And thrust up against each other under these extraordinary circumstances. So naturally, given now the world that the book has come out into, you have been thinking and writing about a family in a situation of similar to the kinds of pressures people are experiencing out there in the world. So I'm just curious to hear how you've now thought about this book in the kind of quarantine context.
Yeah. It was almost eerie to reread it a couple weeks ago in order to kind of prepare to talk about it for readings, because it had so many it had new relevance to my own life in a way I hadn't intended. I did find the family to be sort of a little bit other from me, and that they were really suffering under those conditions. And then I find myself under similar conditions. And, for a woman, especially women, artist, or someone which woman trying to preserve her space, or basically, as Julia calls it, her closet or her spaces, that's hard in normal circumstances, and so what I have really been noticing is how strange and even threatening this has been to my sense of my ability to keep that space. And of course, as a woman, all your generations and generations of women have given up those spaces, and you finally kind of got yours, and sometimes you fear that it's, only under ideal conditions. And so I have been having that feeling. And then it's slightly universalized that I think anyone who's living with a family, I think it's quite a different experience to be going through this alone. But anyone who's living with a family, any kind of family unit, the roles we used to have, not just the space, not the sort of safe space of creation, but also just these personas. I teach, so over here I'm a teacher, and then I come home and I'm a mom, and then over here I'm a this or a writer, and now it's all one big just goulash. And it's very humbling. It's very humbling. And I think if there's anything, good to come out of it spiritually, it's the sense of like, oh, I knew myself under ideal conditions. And now I found myself brave or courageous or kind under those conditions. And who am I under these? That's been, I think, very difficult for a lot of people, including me.
Well, but I guess I'm also curious, in a sense, this was a preoccupation without you knowing it, right? I mean, you decided to write into the question of a family under leaving the circumstances of normal society and taking this radical step. And what is it that fascinated you in the beginning about setting people apart from the ordinary world?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think only because it just raises the stakes. I mean, you put anybody on a boat, and all of a sudden it's just they're gonna make it or they're not. It's just inherently there's a narrative built into that, into the journey. But I think that I have definitely been interested in my other fiction as well, in the as I would put it, the nurturing and deforming effects of the family upon the individual, and then
your book on Anne Sexton, that's what you would say.
That's right. I think I stole it from some criticism about Anne Sexton, but I was like, that's what she wrote about too. But I think that's obviously it's the subject of a lot of literature. I think it's also, for me, it's really extended out, especially in recent years, but certainly in Sea Wife, to what's the nurturing and deforming effects of the community upon the individual, or the political party or the nation. So, and I think I've long been interested in that. And maybe it's also just as an artist, again, you're necessarily so much alone and sort of separate, alone in your creation and alone physically. A lot of the time I've always had a fascination with the community, and an attraction to the community, and a fear of it, and to the family, and a fear of it. And of course, that's, I think, human. It's the family structure. Certainly a marriage has such, and it's such high stakes, such great rewards, and such large pitfalls.
Yes. Needless to say. So, I mean, you mentioned in that answer, you talked about the various kinds of conflicts, and one of the things that I admire about this book is that you've succeeded in drawing this family in this pressure cooker. You've also put on the page some of the political conflicts that we're living with now. So you've got a husband and wife who don't see eye to eye, not so much in a kind of, electoral politics, who you're going to vote for, that's in the background, but a sense of how, whether we see ourselves as dependent on one another in a society, or whether we see ourselves as atoms, totally individuated and free. So I'm just curious, you're writing this, you started this book before Trump was elected, and then you were sort of writing through. So how did you think about the placement of politics, in that sense, kind of capital P politics, into the book?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that the past 4 years have been full of turmoil and upheaval, and it touches every single one of us, no matter what side we're on. And I just found an email. I was looking through our emails, Adam, to trace back where I ran into trouble. And I think, I really couldn't concentrate after, in early 2017, I think was when I was like, wondering how. Well, when you write a novel, as years go by, and in those years things change. That is brought home so much now. How we'll never be the same after this. It's hard to write through that transition, because it would take, as you, in your words, a psychotically consistent persona to do that. So it's the job of the writer to let that come in and let that come into your work. And of course, it's gimmicky and self-serving if it's just attacking it in there and saying, oh, look, I inserted this topic, I'm interested. It does need to make sense. And I remember in an email I found, I woke up one morning and I realized that my characters were already politically separate, that she was already sort of a liberal leaning person and he was a conservative leaning person. Now that was already evident in part of the problems they had with each other, which was like, we need to serve the family. Well, I have my own goals and I want to be free. And it was quite an organic movement for me to incorporate that into the novel. The novel kind of magnetized a lot of issues that I felt in the collective consciousness in the past years in which I've been writing it, not just politics, but also not politics. Really what I'm interested in is polarization. Why and what it means for us, and dialogue. I'm really interested in dialogue. I think I've had to find a way to make these themes really an integral part of the story. I mean, it's still a novel. It's a novel. You don't have to see any of these discussions if you are if you're entranced in the story, and they kind of echo in a very subtle way. But when I showed the page of the book earlier, and how frequently the narration changes between the couple, I started to see it's a book about dialogue and the importance of dialogue and the danger of the failure of dialogue as they run into danger later on, and in the sort of climactic crossing in the last third of the book. And that's really important. And strangely, even though a lot of their problems are, I think, very commonplace marital problems, I think a lot of people can relate to some of their complaints about one another, especially some of the gender issues between them, division of labor and children and child rearing. But it's really this sort of that essential question of like the self versus the community that really decides their fate, especially Michael's. And he keeps a certain integrity to his position in the moment where he actually needs help.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that that I've always, I think you just have always been so good at the representation of marriage and of a long-term relationship, of a kind of a relationship in which things have so many layers to them because time is added on. Love has been sort of worn away in places and has to be fought back. And I just think in all of your work, you've always had a very keen ear and eye for that. And here I was thinking beforehand when I was thinking about what we talk about, that so often you hear people talk about it's a domestic novel, it's a domestic book, versus, as opposed to a social or political book. Like those are separate things. And this is both obviously not literally only domestic, because it's an adventure story. It's a kind of seafaring novel, right? But it's also both a domestic and a political, they're both things. And I guess I'm just curious, just honestly, from a sort of, without giving anything away about the book, there is a kind of feminist dimension to the trajectory of what happens to this family, right? There's the Juliet who begins in a place of depression and being a quasi-failed graduate student of of studying Anne Sexton and this confessional poetry and all these things. She is forced into a circumstance where her own authority has to be asserted. And it's the most that I've seen that delineated in any of your novels, in a sense. The last novel was really primarily more about the father of a child. And so I'm curious what the writing into that kind of strong female point of view was like for you, because she evolves, Juliet. She evolves enormously over the course of the book.
That is a hard question. Maybe I should take a drink. I mean, I will answer it in my own way, which is that, in a relationship, in a marriage, for sure, any long-term relationship, there are three fates. There's the fate of the one person, the fate of the other person, and the fate of the union, right? And I think I was very aware that in this book that they were different. They were different. Juliet it's really her book. It is really her book, and it really is her. You learn later on, not too late into the book, that she really is the narrator of the book. So I think she though she starts, as I read tonight, in a kind of place of sadness and lostness and seclusion, the journey that she goes on is one towards freedom and empowerment. And she definitely has to take the helm, to the nautical metaphor, which are so useful and so bountiful. And she does. And she also has to let go. She also has things in her trauma in her past that she needs to battle. And I think that's the real source, actually, of the battle at sea that she has. Mm-hmm. is against herself and those memories. I finally feel that the end of the book has, especially even like the final scene, has a sense of a positive fate for Juliet, that she gets, that each character kind of gets what they need, even though there's casualty involved. Mm-hmm. And I think Michael, I think he does what he needs to do too. And I think that, she asked the question, is the journey a mistake? Like, if I have to, I know she's a character, but if I had to answer that question myself, I would say no.
Yeah.
No. You have to go where you have to go. You have to go through your challenge rather than around it. Yeah. And so they do. Of course, it's quite externalized there on the sea, but what a great way to see your struggle. You see it in the weather. And sorry.
That's one of the things that you've done so well here is sort of dramatize, in a literal sense, by creating an adventure out of a kind of tension between these two people. That actually goes to, and the audience has heard a bit of the reading now, so the structure of the book and how you've held up the page, so they may have some sense, but it is a kind of a unique structure. I mean, there are books that have alternating point of views, but you really have, like, basically Juliet is left justified, in a sense, on the page, which actually works politically as well, whereas Michael is right justified. So there's a typographical representation, and most of the some sections run a bit longer, but they're overall fairly brief, back and forth. And so I mean, I know, because we talked about it, that you didn't decide that in advance. I'm just curious to how you worked your way into that structure.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. I think that I was so interested in what my characters were thinking about and how that might address conversations I'd had with many other people, that I just wanted to let them speak. And if they said something, I would write it down. Michael on helicopter parenting or something, and I would write that down and just let it stand. And then I would go to the next moment or beat, and Juliet's going to talk about confessional poetry of the 1950s, 60s, 70s. So, and then I'll let her do that, and then I would sort of hope or try to trust that. I think this is how I ended up crying in Pan Quotidian, but like that it would come together, or that that these pieces would stand in some kind of narrative and thematic relationship with each other. I enjoyed that process, but it was, of course, it was difficult, and there were many times when it didn't work, and I had to take those sections out. I was talking with someone at another Zoom reading, and I realized she was quoting from part of the book that was no longer in the book because she had read it in manuscript form. She's like, "I love this part," and it was gone because that it didn't stand with the other pieces. So I enjoyed writing in that way. It felt vital to me. It kept me interested in the work. And also, I think I just have, though I admire extensive exposition and the sort of stable, conventional novel, I think I've been kind of moving away from it for a while. And a lot of the books I admire experiment formally in similar ways. And I mean, including yours, Imagine Me Gone has that wonderful long section of the intake form that the character fills out about himself, in a psychiatric hospital, just using that kind of formal play. It's very energizing, and I think it really touches a nerve, or it describes the way we see or feel these days.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, one of the things about just how you described writing it, and I know because we talked about it, that it's also, you were in essence trusting your own interest, right? Because to just start up, well, now this, I want her to be thinking about Anne Sexton here, or I want, Michael is now curious about this aspect of the boat or whatever. It's like cueing, holding close what interests you in the material as you go along, as opposed to setting yourself, this is the chapter where X, Y, and Z must happen, and so now it's my job to make X, Y, and Z happen. And so there's a sort of trusting in the material, and then the power of juxtaposing, and putting that arranging of the sections.
Yes, absolutely. And the white space does a lot of work. I mean, it does a lot of work that the formal exposition does in another kind of novel. But I like that, again, to use another nautical metaphor, this idea of waypoints, which in navigation and sea navigation is just legs in a journey. But sometimes if you're going across a long part of the sea, you still use waypoints, even though there's nothing there. It's totally abstract. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's coordinates in the middle of nowhere. And I feel like that's how I wrote the book. I'm going to go to this waypoint, and I'm going to see how I get from this waypoint to that waypoint. I'm aware that there's a journey, and I'm very much still a novelist. I want the book to feel really readable and exciting. I love it when people say, I read in a day, or I read it. It's like, that's great. So I'm still very much trying to that's the journey. That's the final destination. But it made sense to me in crafting this particular novel to just use waypoints.
Yeah. Well, and it's also, I mean, one of the things I talk about when, people ask me about writing novels is that the way that you have to survive radical doubt about we were talking about that at the beginning, about when you were at your lowest point in working on this book. And that you have to, it's not just being able to answer the doubt, but being able to endure it, because it's not like you just answer the doubt once and it's gone. Right. It's something that has to be endured over time. Yeah. In a way, I think that's one of the other, I guess that's what I was thinking about too with Juliet in terms of the course of this is that she is a doubter.
Mm.
She is someone who doubts herself. She comes to doubt her husband. She doubts her own choices. I mean, the very beginning, you're like, what, where did my mistake begin? And so I don't know. I guess, I mean, this is knowing you too, but it feels as though there's almost a writing analogy built into the book. Do you know what I mean? That there's no metafictional moment. You don't turn Juliet into a novelist, but that there's some way in which the journey taken is also the journey of the writing.
Yeah, it's true. It's sometimes I feel like when people say it's a suspenseful novel, that what they're feeling is like my suspense and whether or not I could pull it off.
Yeah.
Also of not knowing necessarily where I was headed. And I also think that it's true that writers will sometimes, as a secondary subject, is novel writing itself or artifice itself, especially if you're going to call attention to form, like that intake form that I was talking about. When you do that, you're saying, oh, look, this is a written thing, and that's what we want.
Yeah.
But let's not be so persuaded that we forget that, or that's not why. I think it's fine if you forget it. It's not that. Yeah. It's more interesting in some ways to experiment with what else with all that it can be, right?
Yeah. Well, I noticed that we're at 8:15, so it may be the case. I don't know. We will await the authorities here to tell us whether or not questions.
Melanie was going to. Oh, yeah. And if anyone has any questions, and of course it is be about Sea Wife or something else, you can even ask Adam a question. I'm sure he will.
Yeah, but questions may have been posed. But in the interim, I want to say that I think you type them in the side and then they will appear.
Yeah.
But what I was going to say was the other part I remember about that sticks out to me when I think about the years you were working on this book is when you called me up and in a kind of offhanded way, we're like, yeah, so I'm going to Panama and I'm gonna take Addis, that's Amity's son, and we're like gonna go on this boat and I'm gonna like learn how to sail. And it was not clearly like a kind of glamorous, I'm buying a yacht, you know what I mean? Like I'm going, but it was, and in the back of my mind, I was like, are you endangering your child? Are you completely insane? What is going on? Like, really? But indeed, you did do that, which brings me to the question of the research. I mean, you didn't just read a bunch of articles. You sailed some of the seas that you write about.
Yeah, right. It's true. So I went with Addis on that trip to Panama. That's where I first witnessed this beautiful sovereign territory. It's called Gunayala is its real name. And it was such an extraordinary place. And I think that the book was really born for me there because it is so much about the beauty of, particularly its places, is very untouched. Places where you can, or at least undeveloped, I should say, and that you can reach, only by boat. So that's really wonderful. I think that I'm more influenced probably than I realized by my father and my mother, who used to drag me on weird trips like that too. I mean, and they had huge impact on me. I went to, my father was studied Nepal and India. And so I visited those places when I was, 12 or 13 and lasting impact. And my father never traveled by normal routes on the beaten path, always off, so really there's an homage also to him and to my mother, who is also an adventurer. But the research for the book actually happened, learning to sail. I did not try to attempt with Elvis. I did a separate trip. I did at first. I was with him, but with like a wonderful Spanish couple who did everything for us on their boat, beautiful teak boat, going through Gunayala. Then several years later, once I was in the middle of this book, and I had read all the books, I'd read all the manuals. I still didn't understand anything. I could, I realized I had to actually go and experience these feelings. So I did say to my husband, I was like, I really kind of have to do this. And to his credit, he was like, okay, great. But he told me later that he did have some foreboding when I said, it's not hurricane season, it's not, but that doesn't mean there's not storms. And once I went to Grenada, I was in Grenada, like on the eastern sort of rim of the Caribbean island nation. I did a 10-day sailing course there in December of 2017. And I got to experience the gorgeous, anyone who's been sailing, I'm sure some of you already know this, but when you're out at sea, the weather is so vivid. What we consider a thunderstorm here when there's trees, it's so different with no mediation of the weather. Just huge clouds, huge storms, huge wind, huge waves, incredibly dramatic.
Were you sort of taking notes literally, or did you just come back and then write what you remember?
I did take notes. And finally, I got so stressed out that I think I was quite reliant on taking notes because we did hit some bad weather. And so I finally got to feel the terror of that. And I needed it. But of course, that's exactly what I needed to write the book. You can only understand so much through a book, through a conversation, through a vicarious experience. And you kind of have to go out there and do it. And I think what I realized was that it was useful for me. Juliet's really a novice sailor, as she expresses, and so I was too. So I was in her place. It was very like Stanislavski in this sort of sense that I could understand finally how she really would feel. It was so essential to writing the book. But I also did a lot of research by talking to sailing families, and there are a lot of sailing families out there right now, and some of them have gotten in touch with me, and they are having a unique experience these days. But I had the advice of many of them too as I was writing.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think our moderator
here, Melanie.
Okay, you might have already answered. Put this on really early, but I'm just going to read this from Jenny Egan. I'd love to hear about the process of structuring the book and the decision making around the placement of the 2 points of view on the pages.
I think I did answer that at the beginning. Jenny, do you have another question? It would be my privilege to answer a question of yours.
There's another question while she thinks of something else. This one, John Pettit, he says, what was the origin of Sexton as an inspiration? Did she come before the roles, or did you find her to capture issues?
And Melanie, what was the second part of the question?
Did she come before the roles, or did you find her to capture issues?
Oh, okay. Hi, John. Thank you so much for the question. Anne Sexton, it's like throwing in everything but the kitchen sink when you're writing a novel like this. I'm sure I stole things from people. I stole things from my kids. And Anne Sexton was stolen from myself for a change, which is that when I was in college, I found her. Me and my freshman roommate and best friend were in a poetry class, and she was assigned to us. And it was one of those moments where, we would go to a cafe and just like smoke and read Anne Sexton poetry. And I felt I was really becoming myself. I was really opened up. And her expressions of certain things, first of all, she's an incredible metaphor-ician, if that's a word. She's like an artist of metaphors. It's really unparalleled, and I really love a beautiful metaphor. So I loved studying that about her, but it was also really some of the themes in her poetry, which I now can place a little bit more in historical context of a woman in her time and place, again, without the space, and also just the transition of the nuclear family and the dream and the lie of the nuclear family upon in which she was, seated. And so I when I came to the book, to Sea Wife, she had more resonance because my narrator is, she's a scholar, but she's a poet in her own right, and she's facing some of the same problems that Anne Sexton had faced so much earlier. And there was a poignancy there. There's in the back of the book, there's this sort of like outtakes from the book that I like, but hey, listen, you don't have to read it if you don't want to, but notes. And there's some beautiful, one of her most beautiful poems is about the double image. Is written to her daughter, and she says, I wanted a girl, I didn't want a boy. I wanted a girl loud in the house of herself. And Sexton did have two children, two girls. And I feel like that poem, Double Image, is such a beautiful description of postpartum depression. And I feel that Anne Sexton did have postpartum depression. And I feel like a lot of women poets were struggling with that. And we did not have the language for that.
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
We've got another question from Jenny Egan. She says, you were working on a different book when this one took over. Can you talk a little bit about what that felt like? How did this story invade your imagination?
Wow, that's a great question. And I hadn't thought about that for a while. I didn't look back. That's so true. Jenny is right. I was working with a character from my last book, Schroeder, and I was continuing with him. And I think it's because I just liked his company. And I also really wanted to see, I was still very interested, as I am, in the question of immigration and being an immigrant, as my mother was. And I wanted to bear that out, especially through very recent, well, it's been an enduring issue in our culture, but immigration, disputes about that. So, but I kind of got lost there, and I didn't know what to. I didn't have a story, and I didn't have a story. And then a friend sent me a link to a news story about a couple who was a sailing family, who were sailing across the South Pacific with their two young children when they started to, take in water. And also, actually, what happened was one of the kids got sick in the middle of the South Pacific, which is just really a nightmare. And they needed a Coast Guard rescue. And when they came back to what interested me about the story, I think I'd been interested in families who live in these non-traditional ways for a while, and really interested in contemporary parenting. And so what interested me about the story was that they faced such criticism when they came back to land. Why would you go? Why would you do that? Why would you take your two little kids across the ocean? And I was really agnostic about that. I wasn't sure quite how I felt, but interested enough to take on the research of, well, what is that like? Is that a normal thing to do? Is that a reasonable? Was that a reckless thing to do or not? And
sorry to interrupt. No, I just, but that one of the things that makes me think of is that, that story you're describing is also is taking place now when you say those parents received a lot of judgment. It's like now we have there's a lot of judgment going on about how people are dealing with being in quarantine, and how what are your precautions? What are your ways of doing things? And some of it really intense. And so I'm just like, maybe we don't have a lot of time left, but I'm just curious, kind of given where we began with, and I see someone else made a comment about how much relevant to quarantine this book is as an experience. Like, how have you been experiencing that sense of like judgment, self-judgment? Am I doing what I should be doing in this impossible situation with your kids?
Constantly.
Yeah.
else to say. I mean, yeah, today, it just every minute. There's a beautiful picture. I wish I could show you of my daughter. She's 7, and then I have a 14-year-old son, and one of her best friends lives across the street. So what we've decided is she can have play dates across the street. So they stand across the street and just sort of shout at each other, and but they love it because at least they can see each other. Everybody's doing Zoom play dates, and it's just excruciating. So that's the boundary that holds for them, because otherwise, if you don't give them a boundary, it's too hard for them not to touch each other. And so that's been very poignant to see my daughter shout across the street at her friend while cars go past, and they think she's about to cross, but she's not going to cross.
Yeah. Well, what's our time frame here?
We've got a couple minutes, and just one more question, which is if you have anything that you're working on now, if you wanted to talk about that. Either.
Oh, thank you for the question. I was probably the hardest thing for me about the kids being back at school back at homeschool, is that I was working, really enjoying working on a new project. And all I can say about it right now is it involves women and mountaineering and hiking and lostness. Hey, maybe that's related to right now too. I can't wait to get back and work on that. I've been reading a lot of narratives by female hikers, and doing a lot of hiking myself, which has been a balm. Yeah. What about you, Adam? Are you getting any writing?
I'm working away. I'm scribbling away. Who knows how long? But I wish we could hear and see the faces of those that we want to thank for coming. But it's nice, we would of course love to have been there in person. And the Center for Fiction is a great place. If you haven't visited there, you should go when it reopens. And in the meantime, all you have to do is click the button at the bottom of your screen to support them, and also to get Amity's book. So I feel as though I am now auditioning for being in an infomercial, which I will.
You did that really well.
The next representative of QVC here.
I forgot to get the point at the button like this.
Right. Oh yes.
May I also just thank you, Melanie, and thank the Center for Fiction, which I love and miss, and I love Miss New York City. I can't wait to go back. Thank you for people for coming tonight. I feel you, even though I can't see you. Thanks so much. Thank you, Adam, my writing brother. You're my writing brother.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Amity, and thanks everybody for coming, and we'll see you again soon.
Okay.